Welcome back from the break. My name is Thomas Maurer. I'm a cloud advocate working at Microsoft. And in this next module, we're going to have a look at hybrid compute workloads. And we're going to have a look how we can leverage Azure Management technologies to make our Windows Server on-premises environment even better, and how we can actually manage these workloads. So let's have a look. In this session, we're going to talk about hybrid compute workloads and how companies can take advantage of the cloud in their on-premises environment or in their multi-cloud environment using our hybrid services. For this session, we're going to take advantage of our demonstration company called Tailwind Traders, which actually represents everyone and no one at the same time. And we will run through a couple of demonstration scenarios to show you how Tailwind Traders can make their on-premises environment even better using the cloud. Now, before we actually start and have a look at all these solutions, I quickly want to give you a little bit of background what Tailwind Traders has on requirements and why they are in a hybrid cloud environment. So first of all, Tailwind Traders is already in a hybrid state. They are currently moving workloads to Azure, but some of their workloads need to be on premises, right? There are multiple reasons why these workloads can't be moved to the cloud. They have them running in their local data centers, at their branch offices, factories, or retail stores. And again, these can be scenarios where they have data sovereignty challenges, or networking issues, or latency issues, or no network connectivity available to an Azure region, right? So there are reasons why they want to use a hybrid cloud environment. Now, the next thing they want to do actually is they want to take advantage of the Microsoft management tools for their hybrid environment. They want to use a single set of tools for their workloads running in Azure or in multi-cloud environments and also on premises. They don't want to separate all these tools and use different tools depending on where these workloads are running. And we're going to have a look in this session how you can use basically the same tools, the same control plane for your workloads running on premises, in Azure, or even at another cloud provider. So in this session, we're going to have a look at how Tailwind Traders can decide which hybrid management and monitoring tools they should use in their environment. Now, we're going to have a look at some of their example requirements, right? So we're going to go through a couple of different scenarios. So the first one is we're going to have a look how Tailwind Traders can actually manage their Windows Server workloads with a consistent experience across their hybrid cloud environment. We're also going to look how they can apply policies to their compute workloads in a hybrid environment. And we're going to have a look at how Tailwind Traders can simplify the management and maintenance of their on-premises virtualization fabric, as well as how they can make their file servers more efficient, taking advantage of the scale of the cloud. And then also, last but not least, we're going to have a look at backup and disaster recovery strategies for the Windows Server workloads in a hybrid environment. So we're also going to have a look at a couple of different tools and services. And again, just in case of time, we can't hit all of the possibilities we have in Azure and with our Microsoft tooling. However, we will have a look at a couple of different technologies and services. So we're going to start a little bit with Windows Admin Center, which is our new web-based server manager, if you will, and allows us to manage Windows Server as well as, for example, Azure Stack HCI. We're also going to have a look at Azure Arc enabled servers, which lets us connect on-premises servers or servers running at another cloud provider to Azure Resource Manager, so we can take advantage of the Azure control plane and start onboarding Azure management services, such as, for example, monitoring. We then also have a quick look at Azure Stack HCI, which is our hyper-converged infrastructure, and how you can leverage that for your on-premises deployments. We're also going to have a look at Azure File Sync, again, taking advantage of the cloud for our file servers. And at the end, we're going to have a look at Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery when it comes to our backup and disaster recovery strategies. So let's get started with Windows Admin Center. Windows Admin Center, you can see here a screenshot, is a web-based management console to manage our Windows Server infrastructures as well as clusters, Azure Stack HCI deployments, and so on. Now, this is not something running in Azure. This is something you can download and can install that on premises on your Windows Server or, for example, on your Windows 10 machine. And then it allows you to do remote management of your servers using PowerShell remoting in the background. Now, Windows Admin Center at the same time lets you do a couple of management tasks, like all the regular things you need to do, like device management, event viewer, the new performance monitor, and much, much more. But it is also the gateway to the cloud, right? It allows you easily and simply onboard Azure services like Azure Backup, Azure File Sync, and many, many more to your Windows Server environment. And we're going to have a look at that, and we're going to do most of our onboarding using Windows Admin Center. That said, you can also onboard your Windows Server environment without Windows Admin Center. So if you don't have it in your environment, you can still do that as well. However, Windows Admin Center is free. It's a free download. So if you have Windows Server, you can just go out and download it and then start managing your environment from Windows Admin Center. It then also helps you to do like remote desktop and PowerShell session to the servers you manage. So as I mentioned in the backend, it's using PowerShell remoting to manage these servers. So you can also leverage that. So if there is a tool missing or something like that, you can still go in and just do a PowerShell connection directly from Windows Admin Center. And I mentioned that this is something you can install locally. However, in a new preview, we also allow you to use that directly within the Azure portal. So you can basically go out and if you're having Azure virtual machines, you can use Windows Admin Center directly within the portal as well. Again, that is preview, and we're going to have a look at that later on. So now I mentioned that Windows Admin Center can run locally. So this is our on-premises deployment. So one thing we can do is we can obviously then manage with Windows Admin Center our local servers, right, in our on-premises environment. But then we can also go out and say, hey, we have a couple of Azure machines, and we also want to manage these directly from our Windows Admin Center. So we have something called the Azure Network Adapter, which allows us to create a point-to-site VPN connection from our Windows Admin Center to our Azure Virtual Network, and allows us then basically to manage some of our VMs running in Azure. Again, this is great if I don't have a site-to-site VPN or express route in place, but I have a couple of machines in Azure I want to securely manage from my local Windows Admin Center instance. We can also install Windows Admin Center in a virtual machine running in Azure, and then basically manage our Azure VMs, or also even go backwards and manage our on-premises machines directly from Windows Admin Center running within Azure using a VPN connection or express route, depending on what our setup looks like. So let's have a quick look at the demo of Windows Admin Center. Now here we are in Windows Admin Center, and you can see here it's a web-based UI. You can see in the middle I'm already at the networking tab. On the left side you see all the menu with all our tools and extensions, as we call them. So you can see here I have, for example, device manager, I have events, I have files, firewall settings, local groups and users, PowerShell connections, processes, you name it. And there's much more available here. Now, I can also use that for multiple users, so I need to install it once, and then multiple users can actually connect to that gateway. Now, what I want to show you in this demo is that I can actually create here a Azure Network Adapter. Now, you can already see that this Azure Network Adapter is connected. So I already have a point-to-site VPN connection to my Azure Virtual Network running. And so my Windows Admin Center server actually can connect to that machine. So what I can do here, if I switch back to my management experience, I can see here all my servers and I can add a new connection. So if I click on add, I can then quickly see I have an Azure VM here with a private IP address 10.0.2.4. So I can enter that here. And this will now detect our server. And I can click on add. Again, this is now using a point-to-site VPN connection through Azure to add that server. And if I click on that server, you can see here now I can start managing that server. I get some information here. I get some overview about that server. I can see what operating system it is running. And on the left side, you can see here all the tools I can have. So one thing I want to do here, I want to install a couple of roles and features here. So I'm going to install the DNS server feature. So instead of connecting to the server using RDP, I'm just going to select here that in Server Manager. And then I can also go out and have a look at, for example, other features as well. And you can see here, I can basically go through and install all the feature services and features or roles and features I want to. So I'm also going to install wins because it's wins and not lose. So I can click on install. This will then quickly check all the dependencies as I remember it from Server Manager, and then just click on install, and this will go out and now remotely run the PowerShell commands against my server running in Azure to install the DNS server feature role as well as the Wins server feature and so on with all the dependencies. So this will take a couple of minutes as it would usually take, and after they're successfully installed, I can then go out and have a look at extensions. So we have a preview extensions here for DNS management. So you can see here, this is like basically the extension to manage DNS. So I'm going to install that. And after that's successfully installed, it will reload. And now I can switch back to my server where I just installed the DNS server feature. And now I'm able to use the DNS extension here to actually do my management tasks on that DNS server. So as you can see here, I can now go and create a new DNS zone. So let's create a new primary zone here, call it Tailwind Traders .hybrid. Let's create. And now the zone is created. Now let's do a quick double check. So if I go and have the RTP connected to that server, I can first go to tools, and you can see here I can open up DNS because this is obviously a DNS server. So you can see here the feature at least was installed. If I go to the zones here, you can see here, here's my primary zone for Tailwind Traders .hybrid. So you can see here that I have a great way of managing servers remotely using Windows Admin Center. And with the Azure Network Adapter feature, I can also easily connect to an Azure Virtual Network and manage my servers from my on-premise Windows Admin Center within Azure, which is pretty cool. So for the next part, I quickly want to talk a little bit about how the Tailwind Traders environment gets increasingly complex, right? So we actually had a look at why their environment gets more and more complex, and we discovered three main reasons why this is happening. And I'm sure this also happens to many, many other companies and even real companies outside in the real world. Now, first of all, IT or IT admins and developers, they need to manage hundreds, if not thousands, of different applications. Some of these applications are modern applications written in modern languages like .NET Core and many others. They're running on PaaS services, serverless, containerized, and so on. However, what we also can see is that obviously we have a lot of traditional applications running on virtual machines or even physical machines, right? And IT needs to take care of all of that. Now, another thing we are seeing is that, and I mentioned that before, there's a very diverse infrastructure, right? So companies have their own local data centers. They have some outsourced to local service providers. They're using branch offices. They have factories. They, in some cases, use different OEM hardware. They have IoT and many, many other things they need to take care of. And usually these end up in having multiple management tools and multiple access tools to manage that infrastructure. And then last but not least, there's also multi-cloud, right? So a lot of companies, or many companies, are in a multi-cloud environment. Even though, for example, they decided to go with Microsoft Azure, there are other companies which already have other cloud providers onboarded, right? So, for example, from the past in history, they start with another cloud provider. One department did that, and they're not going to migrate now everything over. Or other companies, for them, it's really a strategy to have multiple cloud providers. But again, this means also that you have additional management resources, right? Now you're not just dealing with one cloud provider and the tools of one cloud provider. Now you need to deal with multiple of those. And we want to address that to make it easier to manage everything with a single control plane. And we kind of have that. So if we look at Azure, Azure has a very good control plane. So this is a high-level architecture view of our Azure Management Services. So let's start on the left here. So we as Azure customers, when we interact with Azure, we're using the portal, PowerShell, the Azure CLI, APIs, the SDKs, and so on. And what we are doing is we are interacting with Azure Resource Manager, which is basically the magic behind all the Azure management tools and experience. So what we have there in terms of security or access when it comes to role-based access controls, logs, subscription management, policies, blueprints, tags, search and indexing, everything you need for inventory or an organization, that is basically done by Azure Resource Manager. And then we also offer on top of that a couple of management services for monitoring, update management, backup, disaster recovery, security, and many, many more. And until we announced Azure Arc, Azure Resource Manager and these management services were mostly designed to manage Azure resources, right? So what we did with Azure Arc, we actually extended the Azure control plane with Azure Resource Manager to allow us onboarding services which live outside of Azure, right? So as of today, with Azure Arc, we can onboard servers, Linux and Windows servers. We can onboard Kubernetes clusters and data services to actually take advantage of that single control plane we get within Azure. And we're going to have a look at that, how that looks like right now in this demo. So here I am again back in my Windows Admin Center installation. You can see here all my servers listed. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to connect a server to the Azure Resource Manager using Azure Arc, the Azure Arc feature. So let's have a quick look. So we're going to select our server 4 here. I'm going to manage that with one of my local credentials here. I'm going to connect. And as you saw before, we can now manage that server. And we could do some management tasks here. However, we will scroll down to settings. And in settings, we can now simply onboard our server to Azure Arc for servers. So what I'm going to do, I'm click on Get Started. I'm then make this a little bit smaller here. I select the right subscription and the right resource group. I want to add that server. I can then also select the Azure region I want to connect that server to. This is only for the metadata connectivity of the Azure Arc agent. And then I can also basically use a proxy server if my server is behind a proxy. So when I click on Setup, this will now set up the Azure Arc server. So it will download the Azure Arc for Service agent. It will install that agent, and then will register my server with Azure. So when this is done, my server will basically show up in Azure as an Azure resource. So here it's now connected. What I can do right now is I can click on View this server in Azure. Open that link. And if I do a quick refresh, you will now see here that I can see here my Azure Arc enabled server I'm just joined. It's now a Azure resource. So I can see it now in the Azure portal. You can see here it looks like an Azure resource. I can do a couple of things. I can do extension management. But let's have a look at one of the features called Insights, which is a monitoring feature. So what we can do here is we can enable Azure Monitor for that server. So I'm going to enable that. This server then needs to be joined to a Log Analytics workspace. And then I can enable the Azure monitoring feature for that server. Again, this server is running locally here in my own Tailwind Traders data center. This, again, will take a couple of minutes to connect everything, to make sure that the agents are installed at the right way and registered to the right Log Analytics workspace. And after a couple of minutes then, I can now see my server coming up here. So what I want to show you here are a couple of things. So first, let's have a look at performance. So here I get some performance monitoring data. I can see how much disk space there is, CPU utilization of that specific system, memory utilization, if you will. I can see the IOPS and disk throughput of that system, as I can do with Azure Monitor. I also have logical disk latency, percentage used, and then also some network information in terms of how much bandwidth I used with my server. I have a couple of other tools here available as well, and I want to quickly highlight that as well. So another thing is the dependency map. So with the dependency map, you can see here, I can actually see to what services or endpoints is my server connecting to. So I get, for example, the information that my server here is connecting on port 445 to one server here, which is a local server or a local IP running in my own location. However, I can see that for many, many other systems as well. And that really helps me to see, hey, what are the dependencies between the different systems and why is my server connecting to that? I can then also build security monitoring on that if I want to, and I can get much, much more out of that. Now, Azure Monitor is just one feature which is embedded into Azure Arc enabled servers, and there's much, much more when it comes to that. So this was the Azure Arc enabled servers demo. Let's have a quick look at the architecture here. Now, what we have seen here is that we actually connected our on-premises server, again, this can be a Linux or Windows server, to Azure. And then we onboarded that to the Azure Resource Manager, and then we can onboard services like Azure Monitor, Azure Policies, Update Management, and so on, like we would do with an Azure VM. Now, again, as I mentioned, there's much, much more you can do with Azure Arc enabled servers, and I want to give you a quick key takeaways what we actually can do. So with onboarding servers to Azure Arc, we can actually get an inventory of all of our Windows and Linux servers, physical and virtual machines running in our private data centers or hosted clouds, and it's completely domain agnostic. I can also take advantage of the governance and security tools in Azure, and we're going to show you more in this training as well. So you will be able to use built-in policies to manage Azure and Azure Arc enabled servers. We will take advantage of Azure security centers and security baselines. So you get basically one view to see all of your compliance or your compliance overview. You get role-based access, so you can actually get access to the different servers you want to. And if you're a managed service provider, you can also combine it with Azure Lighthouse. And then last but not least, obviously, by adding that server, you get basically a searchable inventory and experience in the Azure portal, which you can also leverage, by the way, using CLI or PowerShell or whatever you're using to access, like get the data from the Azure from Azure. You can then get through it and see an overview of all your systems. Doesn't matter if they're running in Azure, on premises, or at another cloud provider. And then you can take advantage of tools like, for example, tags to manage these servers and organize these resources. So the next thing I want to talk about is extending the virtualization fabric or modernization of the virtualization fabric of Tailwind Traders. And for that, I want to talk about Azure Stack HCI, which stands for Hyperconverged Infrastructure. Azure Stack HCI is part of our Azure Stack portfolio. And again, Azure Stack is not just a single product or solution anymore. It's now a set or a portfolio of products, if you will, with Azure Stack Hub and Azure Stack Edge. And when it comes to our hyperconverged infrastructure, we have Azure Stack HCI. And Azure Stack HCI offers a couple of different features. And so let me quickly talk about this. First of all, it's our hyperconverged infrastructure stack. It's now we have now a specialized host operating system. It's based on Windows Server, but we took everything out which is not needed for as a hyperconverged infrastructure. So everything is not needed for virtualization, networking, storage. We have taken that out, and we have built in additional new features, like, for example, stretched cluster, so you can have an active cluster over multiple regions, faster resync of storage spaces, and then also integrated, for example, full stack updates with our OEMs together, so you can actually go out and run an update over all of it. We also deliver it now as a Azure service. So that means it's natively integrated within Azure. So that means no agent or anything to install. Azure Arc is basically built in to the Azure Stack HCI operating system. And then you can manage it through the Azure portal if you want. You get the great Azure support with a dedicated support team in Azure. And you also get your billing over Azure itself. So we will have an Azure subscription, and that's what basically your billing information goes against it. We also will offer self-service VM creation, so you can then actually go out and create your virtual machines on your local Azure Stack HCI installation directly from the Azure portal with the same experience. And again, think about role-based access and other things which come in very handy when you do that. But this is not a complete new experience. So you can also leverage your existing skills and knowledge you already have of managing Windows Server and your infrastructure. So you can actually go out and customize the hardware of your choice, right? So we have a huge catalog of Azure Stack HCI validated hardware together with our OEMs, where you can pick and choose and build it in the right size you actually need it. From very small 2-node clusters, for example, for your branch offices, up to very high performance 16-node and large-scale clusters as well. You can use the familiar tools like Windows Admin Center, System Center, PowerShell, third-party solution like Altaro Backup, for example, and you get full access to the Azure Stack HCI, full administrative control over that. If you need to install something or need to change something, you can actually go out and do that. So we want to talk about file servers now. I think everyone got them and everyone needs to manage them, but they have been here for years, but it's time a little bit to modernize them. So I want to give you an example of the Tailwind Traders environment here before I actually going to show you a demo here. So first of all, Tailwind Traders has a file server in New York where users and applications are accessing these files. What Tailwind Traders did is they connected that to an Azure file share using Azure File Sync. And that gives them immediately one benefit, and that is cloud tiering. So they can now say, okay, I want to only keep files which are younger than 2 months, for example, on-premises storage. storage, and everything else gets offloaded to the cloud. However, the files still show up on the local file share, but when a user clicks on it, the file will be downloaded from the cloud, so you can actually save some disk space. You also get now cloud access. So instead of, for example, the need of accessing that local file server, users working from home can now access that file share. We also get multi-site sync. So they also want to have the exact same files available in their Seattle office. So they can just add a second server to their Seattle office and synchronize these files over the cloud using Azure File Sync. And while these files are already on this file share, they can take advantage of Azure Backup, which then can just back up that file share. And in case you need to restore something, you can easily do that in Azure. And again, Azure Backup is a great service. We will talk a little bit more about it soon. But it gives you, for example, 99 years of retention, so you can store it for a very, very long time. It's very cost effective, so very great service. And then another scenario here would be rapid file server disaster recovery. So what happens if the file server in Seattle crashes? So usually Tailwind Traders would send home all their employees. No one would be able to access that file server anymore, and then would just wait until they set up a new server, they reinstalled everything, and they started to restore all these files. Now with Azure File Sync, they can just basically spin up quickly a new server. Let's say it's called server 3. They can go out and install the agent, and the agent will now register again with the Azure file share. It will download the metadata. So in a couple of minutes, all the files will appear again on server 3. Now for the user, it looks like all the files are already back. However, when they click on a file again, it will download the file from the file share over the internet in the background. So you don't need to wait until everything is completely restored. You can immediately let users work again. So let's have a look how that can look like in a little bit more advanced architecture. So when we have our on-premises environment on the left and our Azure environment on the right, you can see here I have on-premises, I have a domain controller, and I use Active Directory AD Connect to synchronize my identity with Azure AD. And then on premises, my clients are actually accessing, for example, different file servers. In this case, it can also be just one, but like in many cases, you have multiple file servers in different locations. And what we are doing with Azure File Sync, we are basically synchronizing these with an Azure file share living in Azure. Now, an advantage now is also that now clients which are not in the office, which are not next to a file share, they can now access the Azure file share from wherever they are. Again, if you enable that feature, so you can actually enable them from working from home with that file share. So actually great solution here. So let's have a quick look at the demo here of Azure File Sync. So here I am in Windows Admin Center again, and I already prepared a file server here, which I want to connect to Azure, to an Azure file share using Azure File Sync. So I click on file server 1, and now what I'm going to do is I'm quickly have a look what files do we have here. So we have a built-in file explorer in Windows Admin Center. And I can see here on the E drive, I can see here I have a folder called Designs with folder A, folder B, folder C, and folder D with a couple of files in it. All right. So you can also have a look at the file share. So you can see here we have a file share called Designs, which I actually share these. And so what I want to do here on file server 2, I want to have the same look I had on file server 1. So here I have a file share called Designs as well. Now if I have a look at the files here, You can see here my E drive again. I have a folder designs, and you can see here this is empty currently, right? So I don't have any files on file server 2, but I want to have the same files from file server 1 on both file servers available at the same time. So I go back to file server 1, and I'm going to set up Azure File Sync. And again, this wizard will help me to set this up. So I'm going to select the right region for my file sync. And you can see here, I want to edit the resource group, for example. So I create a new Azure resource group for my file share. I create a new storage sync service, and this will then also go out and create all of these resources. So it creates my Azure resource group, my sync service. It will download the agent for the Azure File Sync and will register that server with Azure. So after that is done, my server is now set up and connected to that sync service. However, I did not sync a folder yet. So I need to go out and select the folder I want to sync. So on my E drive, we now provide the name of that folder. So you can see here it now shows E designs, and then I can enable tiering if I want to, and then I can configure how much space I want to keep free. I then also configure that for a sync group. Give that sync group a name because I want to join the other server to the same sync group. I create a new Azure file share to sync that server, and that means also I need a new storage account. So I'm going to create that, and again, Windows Admin Center does all of that for me. I can do the same thing in Azure without Windows Admin Center, but Windows Admin Center really makes it easy for me to onboard Azure File Sync. So you can now see that we also have that sync set up, and that tiering is enabled, and that folder is actually syncing. So if I go to my Azure portal, if I go to resource groups, you can see here I have my hybrid file share resource group, and I have a couple of stuff in there. I have my sync service as well as my storage account. If I go to my storage account, I have a file share. In that file share, you can now see all the folders with the files are synced from file server 1. So the next thing I want to do is now I want to have the same files, obviously, not just in Azure, but also on my file server 2. So I'm going to set up the same thing on my file server 2. This time we have some small differences because most of the stuff is already created. So it already selected the right resource group, the already existing storage sync service. It installs the agents and registers that server. Now, again, I need to now add which folder should be synced. So I can actually select my folder here and then also say, okay, I want to join that sync group. So let's do E designs. And then again, select the existing sync group this time, the existing storage account, and just set it up. And now it says successfully synced that folder. So if I now go back to the files, you can now see here I have the same folders available and same folders and files available on file server 2 as well. So I want to show you one thing here, that all files are available right now. So if I create a new folder, I can create folder E, and now that folder is created. There's obviously nothing in there, but let's create another folder here called subfolder, just so you see that there's no issues. So let's go back to Windows Admin Center. And now we go to file server 1. And now we want to see if the same folder is now on server 1 as well. So I'm going to my file share drive. And now you can see here, I have folder E now also available on file server 1. So this is a great sync. We're basically now syncing these files and folders over Azure between different servers. And so we always have the same files and folders available on all of our locations of Tailwind Traders. So the next thing I want to talk about is Azure Backup. Now, Azure Backup is a great quick win for Tailwind Traders environment. So what it allows us to do is actually simply not just backup and restore services in Azure, but also do that in a hybrid environment. It basically automatically allocates and manages the backup storage in the background, so you don't need to take care of that. You don't need to add more storage to the backup pool and stuff like that. You basically have unlimited scale available with local redundant storage and geo-redundant storage. Again, depending on your requirements, you can choose which one works better for you, or what are your requirements. It also obviously depends on the price you want to spend. And then there is no charge, by the way, for data when you need to restore, right? So you obviously, if you're familiar with Azure, usually ingoing traffic to Azure is free, and then outgoing traffic to Azure, there's some cost involved. We don't want to charge you if you restore a backup, right? So we don't do that in terms of when it comes to Azure Backup. And you have a pay-as-you-use model, right? So you only pay for the things you actually need and not for the storage. You don't need to pre-reserve storage or anything like that. You can just pay, and as soon as your storage grows, you obviously will also pay more automatically. Everything is encrypted. So when it comes to like data in transit from your on-premises machine to Azure, this is encrypted. Your on-premises to Azure Backup, the data in Azure, which is encrypted at rest with a key phrase we will set up when you set up the backup, and we'll show you that in a quick demo. So you bring basically your own key phrase. And then for Azure VMs, for example, the data is encrypted at rest using the storage service encryption. Now, I also want to say there are some other features and properties with Azure Backup. So you have, for example, an application consistent backup. You have no limited amount of time data is stored in your recovery vault. You have a limit of 9,999 recovery points per protected instance. And then you have multiple options depending on what you need when it comes to Azure Backup, right? So for example, you have the Azure Backup agent, which you can actually go out and just install an agent on a Windows 10 machine or on a Windows server and then back that up. If you need to, for example, need to back up multiple systems or also applications, we have also something called the Azure Backup Server, which you can basically download and install for free on premises. And then you can do a short-term backup on that backup server and then offload the long-term backup to Azure. Azure Backup is also the service which basically backs up your Azure infrastructure as a service virtual machines, including, for example, SQL and Windows IaaS VMs. And then, as I mentioned before, it also can back up your Azure file shares as well. There's also more. So if you, for example, look at Azure Backup Server, it can back up and restore VMware VMs as well, Windows and Linux. Again, same thing, by the way, for Hyper-V VMs. You can back up files, folders, volumes, VMs applications like Exchange or SQL or SharePoint, and you can also back up like the system states of servers as well. It then backups basically to local attached disks for short-term storage. So if you need to back it up and then quickly restore it, you can do that directly without anything. But then for the long-term storage or also off-site storage, if you will, we have the Recovery Service Vault in Azure. Also mention quickly, because we get these questions a lot, it also does application-aware snapshots using VSS. It's full flexibility for when to take the backups. You can completely configure that yourself. And you can also have a recovery granularity depending on what you actually want to recover. Now, if you look at an Azure backup architecture, what we can see here, for example, we have an on-premises environment. We have a couple of workload servers like SQL, SharePoint, Exchange, file servers, and domain controllers. And then what we did here in this scenario, we installed a Azure backup server, which will actually back up these workloads. And then you can send them through Azure, again, over the internet or over ExpressRoute, or use even the Azure import and export service to actually, like when you have a big chunk of data you want to move, you can, for example, also leverage that as well. And then this will be stored basically in the Azure Recovery Vault, which will manage the storage in the background. We use Azure Storage for that. And then you can also replicate that to a secondary Azure region to make that like disaster recovery basically enabled if one of the Azure regions should go down. So let's have a quick look at Azure Backup. So here I'm back in Windows Admin Center. And what I want to do here is I want to back up the files on one of my servers here. So as you can see here, I click on my file server 1, which we used before. So if I quickly have a look at the files on that server, I can see here that I have my E drive. I now have a folder called Research. And in that folder, again, I have folder A, folder B, folder C, folder D. And now I want to configure Azure Backup to actually back up the folders and the files on that machine. So what I can do here is I can simply click on Setup Azure Backup. And this will then go out and ask me for my user account. It will also set up the Azure Backup for me. And then it will ask me, what do I want to back up? Now, in my case, I just want to back up the files on my E drive. And then here I can go out and I can select the retention rate and the schedules basically of the backup. So in this case, very simply, I select one of the pre-configured ones, daily, retain 30 days. And then I can enter my passphrase, my personal one I want to create. This is very important. If I need to restore files, I will need that passphrase. So make sure you save that on a secure location, because we can't help you restoring that. So now it sets up Azure Backup. It will install the backup agent in this case, and then will automatically configure the backup as I configure that. Now, it's obviously going out at a specific schedule, but I can also trigger the backup. So I'm going to trigger the backup to create a recovery point right now. This will start the backup and will take a couple of minutes to complete, especially because this is the initial backup. So on the jobs, I can actually see what is going on here. So if I refresh, you can see that at the moment, data is now transferred, and basically the backup is now completed. So I have now one recovery point basically of these files. So if I click on that, you can see here when this recovery point was created. And again, I can do that for multiple times, obviously. Now I go back to my files here. And what I'm going to do here in my research folder, I'm just going to now accidentally delete folder D. So folder D is now deleted with all the files in there. Now let's switch back to my server to actually show you that. So I'm here on that server. And if I go to my E drive, you can see here I have my folders research. And again, you can see folder D is gone. Now I want to restore that. I can simply open up the Azure Backup console here. And you can see here I can find the same information here. And now I can click on recover data. I can say, okay, I want to recover from this server, just files and folders. So I don't want a whole drive. I just want to have some files from that. You can see here, it was bold marked my last recovery point. You can also have, again, if you have multiple of these will show. And now it will basically open up that recovery point and mount it. And now I can go and see that mounted recovery point. So if I click on it, you can see here folder D is now here in this recovery point. So I can do a copy and then simply go to my server, go to research, and then basically just go and paste folder D back. And so my folder D is now restored. I can also unmount the recovery folder or the recovery mount point, and my files are available again. So this was Azure Backup. Again, there are multiple scenarios you can use that. However, there is even more. So we can also leverage this, Azure Site Recovery for disaster recovery. So what we can do here is we can actually replicate physical and virtual machines running on Hyper-V and VMware to Azure to then actually have a failover region basically available. So in this scenario, I'm going to show you here with Azure Site Recovery. You can see on the left side, I have my on-premises environment, which is basically, for example, in this case, a web app. So we have a IaaS web server and we have a database server, and we use Azure Site Recovery here to replicate it through Azure. And in case of a disaster, we can then go and fail over our virtual machines to Azure. So in this case, you can see on the right side, it would then have my web server and my SQL server restoring or recovering in Azure. And if we then have a service in front of it called, like, for example, Traffic Manager or Front Door, or depending on your architecture and your scenario, in this scenario, we would have, for example, Traffic Manager. We would just basically switch the routing, the DNS routing, from the location from our on-premises primary side to our Azure failover side, and the application would be available for the end users again. So absolutely great service. So let's go into a quick summary. So what we have seen so far is how Tailwind Traders can use Windows Admin Center to consistently manage Windows Server workloads in a hybrid cloud environment. So you can take advantage of Windows Admin Center. You can basically go out and use that today. Even if you're not working with Azure, Windows Admin Center is a great management tool for Windows Server. We also saw how Tailwind Traders can take advantage with Azure Arc and basically connect servers to the Azure control plane with Azure Resource Manager and manage them if they're running in Azure, on premises, or even at other cloud providers. We also had a quick look at Azure Stack HCI, our hyper-converged infrastructure solutions, which is a great solution if you do virtualization in your own data center. We had a look how Tailwind Traders can make their file servers more efficient using Azure File Sync. And then we had a look at how Tailwind Traders can take advantage of the cloud for the disaster recovery strategy using Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery. So here are some additional resources. So again, I spoke about Windows Admin Center. I spoke about Azure Arc enabled servers, Azure Stack HCI, Azure File Sync, Azure Backup, and Azure Site Recovery. So we put all the links here together for you. So you have aka.ms, and then depending on the technology you want to have a look at. You can also follow our team, so make sure you check out itopstalk.com. You can also follow us on Twitter on itopstalk. So this concludes part 1. So let's have a quick recap on what we have learned so far. First, we had an overview about hybrid cloud computing. Then we actually had a look at hybrid networking and how you can connect your on-premises environment to Azure using site-to-site VPN, ExpressRoute, and much, much more. In the third module, we have learned how we can leverage Azure Management technologies to manage our hybrid compute workloads. So thank you for your attendance of this first part, and we're looking forward to have you in the second part of our Microsoft Virtual Training Day implementing hybrid infrastructure.